Hi there bookish friends, I'm Ray and today I'm going to be talking about the very best books that I read in 2021. Like last year, I've split this into a few different categories and the first category is dependable delights. These are books which I knew going into them I was going to really enjoy and they didn't let me down at all. They're books which either because of the author or the publisher, I just feel like you can put a lot of faith in the fact that these are going to be really enjoyable, delightful, charming, comforting reads. The first of these are two books, both by Laura Wood. They are A Snowfall of Silver and A Sky Painted Gold. Laura Wood writes young adult romance novels, and I find with young adult books that the majority of them often fall into a category where, for me, when I read them as an adult, they can easily feel silly or frothy or frivolous, and even though they can be a fun read, they don't kind of stick with you and feel like they have some substance, whereas Laura Wood's books, to me, just manage to cross that balance line of having enough substance that they feel like a really worthwhile read. They often inspire me to be a better person, to be a better supportive person for young people who are going through that stage of coming to know themselves and find themselves, whilst at the same time I really love her writing, I really love her settings and plots. These books are actually kind of sister novels. So A Sky Painted Gold is the first one, which tells the story of a young girl in Cornwall who gets involved with a really wealthy family in the 1920s, and it's about how she both supports this family going through their own problems which she hadn't even conceived could happen because they had so much money, and also about how she kind of finds herself during this process. And then the next book is the story of her younger sister who wants to be an actress and runs away to London age 18 to join a touring theatre company. So the first one is set in the 1920s, the second one in the 1930s. You don't need to read them in order. I actually read them the wrong way round and it doesn't matter at all. It's just quite nice in terms of you get a bit of character crossover when you read the other one. It's nice to revisit characters who you've seen before. The second book, and the only one which I actually have in physical copy to show you because I'm at my parents' house and so I don't have most of the books with me, but I got this one for Christmas because I wanted to have it in hard copy so much. This book is called The Skylark's War by Hilary Mackay. I'm not generally going to be talking about rereads as part of this video, but I have never talked about this book before on this channel and I love it so much, and I really think that people who watch this channel would also really love this book, so I wanted to have an opportunity to talk about it because even though it was a reread, definitely still up there as one of the very best books that I read this year. I adore this book so much. This is the story of Clary who grows up during the early 1900s and begins to come of age at the same time as the First World War hits. It has some of my absolute favourite tropes in literature. It has the idyllic childhood time in Cornwall, which I can't get enough of. What I think this book does absolutely fantastically is that it doesn't disguise at all the hardships of growing up during that time. There's a lot about boarding school, about how difficult boarding school was for the children who went there, but also about how girls weren't given as good an education as boys, and Clary, who is incredibly bright, has to really fight for the education that she deserves. And at the same time, as it transitions into the First World War, there is so much about the enthusiasm with which the boys go into the war and the trauma that they come out of it with, as well as the experience of the women on the home front and how realities were hidden from them, especially from the younger people, in the letters that were sent home and what they were and weren't told about the war. This is just an incredible piece of literature. I would recommend this honestly to everybody. The characters are fantastic. I love them all for different reasons. They all feel real. The story is just completely gripping from start to finish, and this reads like a classic. I don't think I've ever read another work of children's fiction that is written in the modern day that reads as much like a classic as this does. This is easily, for me, as good as things like The Railway Children or A Little Princess. It's just beautiful writing, fantastic story, wonderful characters, fabulous piece of historical fiction. The last couple of books that I wanted to talk about under Dependable Delights are by P.G. Wodehouse. So I've got into P.G. Wodehouse this year, and I know that so many people talk about him and his writing as being such a delight, and I kind of just want to join that club. I've been listening to Stephen Fry's reading of a number of P.G. Wodehouse books on Audible. So the ones that I've actually read so far are The Inimitable Jeeves and Carry On Jeeves. I think that all of the Jeeves and Worcester books are fairly similar, but the language is just absolutely hilarious, and I have them as an ongoing audiobook in the background that I just listen to if I'm feeling a bit down or I'm feeling a bit tired and I don't want to have to pay too much attention, and I'm just constantly laughing out loud. They are such a delight, the epitome of a delight, and I'm really thoroughly enjoying them and glad that I found P.G. Wodehouse at this time in my life so that I can enjoy him in little bits and pieces till the end of my days. Moving on to the next category, these are sadder stories that really stuck with me. So stories which I didn't enjoy as kind of life softeners, books that made me feel good, but which I found for whatever reason were incredibly moving and powerful, beautifully written, and I'm really, really glad that I've read them. In fact, some of my favourite books of the year have fallen into this category. So the very first book that I'm going to talk about is one that I read back in January, which has stayed with me the whole year. I remember so clearly when I read it in January, I thought this could easily be the best book that I read all year. And although I think it has been knocked off the top spot, it is definitely really, really up there, and that is Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thane. This is a family saga. It's a dual narrative story which runs simultaneously in the modern day and also back in China throughout the Cultural Revolution. So in the modern day, it follows Li Ling and her mother, who are living in Canada and accept the refugee Aiming, who's travelling after the Tiananmen Square massacre. It turns out that there's a close historical family bond between the families of these two girls, and the rest of the story explores historically what this bond was and how it came to be. I can almost feel myself wanting to cry thinking about this novel because I cared about the characters so much, and one character in particularly just had all of my heart, and to this day I think about her really, really regularly, far more regularly than you should probably think about a fictional character who you read about pretty much a year ago. The story has almost a magical realism feel to it. I don't think it is magical realism, but it's a story that swings, I think, between fiction and reality. So I read it as a bit of an exploration of the power of fiction and the ability of stories to change history and to create history, and the way that we have control over what history is through stories, but not only the way that a state and an authoritarian power has the capacity to do that, but also the way that we as individuals have the capacity to do that. And this book was a fantastic exploration of the way that we form ourselves through stories and through connections with art, even in the face of a totalitarian regime which is trying to kind of erase that. It was also a very powerful exploration of the meaning and necessity of music, and I think through music, of the arts more generally. An awful lot of the story is set around a musical conservatory, and lots of the characters are incredibly talented at playing instruments, and I just loved that aspect of it. It's something that I really enjoy in literature, is this exploration of the necessity of the arts, almost especially at the hardest times in our lives. The story was complex, but I found it utterly gripping, absolutely beautifully written, and easily one of the most powerful things that I read this whole year. The next book that I've got here are the first two books from Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy. I read all three. For me, the third book was nowhere near as good as the first two, so I'm just going to talk about the first two here. And they are Titus Groan and Gormenghast. These books, I kind of really struggle to talk about them because they're so deeply unusual and also so brilliant that I just don't know where to start. I adored these books. I really, really adored them. Possibly the best books that I've ever read, and I feel like that's a kind of strange view for me to have on them because I don't think they necessarily fall into the category of the kind of book that I would normally really adore. They're very odd, quite gothic. They are set in this ancient crumbling castle in a kind of in a fantasy world in terms of it clearly isn't our world, but not a fantasy world in terms of it doesn't have, which is wizards, magic, any of that sort of thing. But it's this castle that is completely shrouded in tradition, and the inhabitants of it lead these lives where they almost don't have a second to themselves because everything that they do is following the traditions of this ancient castle of Gormenghast. The castle itself has a character. The setting is one of the most powerful settings that I have read in a story. It definitely feels like it has a role in the plot, even though it doesn't move, it doesn't change, it doesn't do anything weird. It just is there, kind of radiating its energy into the lives of the characters and into the plot. So the story begins in Titus Groan with the birth of Titus, who is the heir to the castle of Gormenghast, and we then follow him growing up over the course of the trilogy. However, although he is sort of the protagonist in terms of being the title character, these are very much books that don't have a clear individual protagonist. There are a lot of characters in them, and I think many of the different characters each carry an equivalent level of weight in a way in terms of their contribution to the plot, and I really, really like that. One of the many things that I love that Peake does is he has a range of characters who each display a range of emotions. This is not a book which is specifically sad or happy or angry or any given emotion. Every single character feels and displays the full range of emotions, and it feels very real in that sense, even though in almost every other sense it doesn't feel real. Their characters are all utterly eccentric, very much in the Dickensian style, completely wacky, to be honest, with nervous tics and doing odd things. Very, very entertaining. These books made me laugh till I cried in places, and then they also made me cry till I cried in other places. They were so emotionally all over the place in a way which felt very real, even though, like I said, the story itself is kind of odd. I think if there were to be a protagonist, it would be this character called Steerpike, who is a young boy from the kitchens who kind of climbs his way up the ladder of power, and it's definitely about the politics of the castle and the relationships between all these different characters. Peake's writing is just phenomenal. He has an incredibly imaginative and creative use of metaphor and of descriptive language. The plots kind of start off slow and take a while to get going, but then I found wrapped tighter and tighter to a point where I absolutely couldn't put them down, and I just thought these were incredible works of genius that definitely deserve to be so much better known. Next up we have The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. This is a story of a family who travel as economic migrants to California in the time of the Great Depression. It took me a little while to get into this book, but the second half of it I just felt got better and better, and the poignant and emotional portrayal of this family's experience of hardship and of trying to do what was right in a world where doing what was right wouldn't keep them alive was incredibly moving and realistic, and felt really relevant to the modern day when there are still so many people travelling in absolute desperation as economic migrants. This was an incredibly humanising story, and the ending especially I will never forget. Lastly, a quick mention of a non-fiction book. I haven't read that much non-fiction this year, and in general the non-fiction that I've read has kind of reminded me why I prefer reading fiction to non-fiction. I just enjoy fiction a lot more. But I did read The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, and I thought this was absolutely fantastic. It was definitely one of the very best pieces of non-fiction that I read this year. This is a collection of essays written by Du Bois in the early 1900s about the realities of the lives of people of colour across America at that time, and he just writes in such a balanced, moving, dignified way, with such beauty and richness to his language, such perceptiveness and honesty, and I just found this incredibly moving and eye-opening, and in many ways tragic, because I think a lot of the subject matter in here still felt very relevant for the modern day, even though we're now over 100 years on after Du Bois first wrote these essays. He's a man who you can't but deeply admire when you read his work, and I would very highly recommend. On to the next category of life-enhancing reads. These are books which I really enjoyed for whatever reason, but one of the aspects that I really enjoyed about them is that I felt that in some way I took away some kind of life lessons with them. They widened my world, gave me strong moral role models who I think about, that sort of thing. The first of these books was a book which just really surprised me by how good and kind of deep it was. I thought it was going to be a fun, light, frothy read, but it actually had a real depth to it that I wasn't anticipating, and that kind of took me off guard. This was Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce. This is a story of a young reporter called Emmy Lake who ends up writing in the agony aunt pages of a women's magazine during the Second World War. Her boss is this really cranky old lady called Mrs. Bird who doesn't seem to have any respect for the reader's genuine, difficult, challenging problems that they're going through, particularly regarding relationships, and it's about Emmy's attempts to correct this and to do what she feels to be the right thing. What I think A.J. Pierce has done amazingly here, besides this being a wonderful work of historical fiction, which really gives you a sense of what it was like living in London during the Blitz and of the realities of the problems and the challenges faced by women on the home front, is that she also creates in Emmy this really likeable character who you're absolutely rooting for, who you can see desperately trying to do the right thing, but kind of making the sorts of mistakes you can easily make when you're young and being too enthusiastic and thinking that she can solve too much by herself, and in doing this getting herself into these scrapes and difficulties which are deeply painful to observe, and when you feel so bad for her because you know that she was really trying to do her very best. And I loved Emmy's cheerful, go-getter attitude to life. I loved the way that she saw her work as something which was really necessary and important, and I love the way that she saw her work as being something which was really necessary and important, and that she gladly dedicated time to her work because she felt like she was making positive changes in the world through it. I found that really inspirational. Overall, I was just absolutely rooting for her, wanting to be a bit more like her, whilst I also found this story completely gripping, thoroughly enjoyable, and significantly more moving than I had anticipated. The other book that I put in this category is South Riding by Winifred Holtby. This to me read like a more modern Middlemarch, so imagine an interwar period Middlemarch, in terms of it definitely encapsulates an entire village with a multitude of different characters, and we see their lives as they stand individually but also as they mix with the others' lives, and in doing this Holtby gives you a sense of the state of a nation at a particular moment in history. This was really incredibly well written. Each of the individual characters, and there were many characters in this book, was very well rounded. They all had flaws, nobody was perfect, but you also saw their life more fully, and so you understood why they weren't a very good teacher, or why they were unkind to their child, or whatever it was. You could see the wider aspects of their character and of their life circumstances that made them into the person who they were, and although you didn't necessarily like all of them, you really could empathise with and understand every single character. I put this book in this category though, particularly because of the one character who I would say was possibly the protagonist. A little bit like Gormenghast, this was a book that didn't have a protagonist per se. There was definitely quite a large cast of characters, and each of them had a fairly hefty role to play in the making up of the story overall. But if there had to be a protagonist, I think it was the head teacher in this novel, who was a middle-aged lady who'd come up to London in order to take in hand the girls' school after having lost her fiancé during the First World War. She was a real force of nature, somebody who just worked so hard and had so much energy to pour into making the world a better place, whilst also enjoying herself and enjoying life. And she was a really moving character because she'd actually got a really upsetting history behind her, from having lost her fiancé in the First World War to feeling like she hadn't been able to get married because there just weren't enough men as part of her generation because so many young men had died in the First World War. I found this character a real inspiration, and I found the novel overall such an important reminder that what we see superficially of people's actions is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of their life circumstances and what they might actually be experiencing in their day-to-day life that makes them into who they are. I would highly recommend this book, definitely a modern classic. The last category is just some honourable mentions that I didn't feel really fitted into any of the above categories, but that I didn't want to go without mentioning. The first one of these I almost wanted to put into a category of its own called Surprise Delights, because this was a book that I honestly didn't think I was going to like that much, and actually turned out to be one of my most memorable and enjoyable reading experiences of the year. And this was Hetty Feather by Jacqueline Wilson, and the whole series that comes with it. There are 5 books in the series. I read this just because it had been on my radar for a long time. I knew that children in my class at school had enjoyed it. However, when I was a child, I had not really liked Jacqueline Wilson's writing. I've read 1 or 2 of her books as an adult just to kind of be aware of what my students are reading, and again, didn't really like them, didn't think they were particularly well written, thought they were fine, but not something that I particularly loved. And then when I read Hetty Feather, which is the story of an orphan child who grows up at the Foundling Hospital in London, I was utterly blown away. It was just so engaging. Hetty is this really delightful, likeable character, and in general I felt that Wilson really managed to balance the stories being a bit far-fetched and child-friendly with being thoroughly readable and believable, and covering a lot of the hardship that Hetty actually faced in her life in a way which was very palatable to a child and wouldn't be traumatic and upsetting. I really enjoyed following Hetty's whole journey. Initially I loved the first 2 books the very best, but having got to the end of the series I do feel like it was worth my while to read the entirety of the series, and I'm ever so glad that I did get around to reading these. They are by an absolute country mile the best Jacqueline Wilson books that I've ever read. Lastly, not a surprise because I really thought that I would enjoy these books, and I very much did. This was The Children of the Famine trilogy by Marita Conlon McKenna. This is a story of a family of children in Ireland who have to walk across the country after losing their parents in the Great Famine, looking for distant relatives who they hope will take them in. I found this a really, really interesting way to learn about that period of Irish history, which I didn't know very much about. First book is very much a quest narrative that follows the children as they're journeying across Ireland in the search for their distant relatives. And then the second book focuses on the youngest of the characters, Peggy, as she emigrates to America, about her experience on the journey, and particularly after she arrives. I found this a really eye-opening look at the hardships that children, because I think she's 13 when she goes, that children face turning up in a new country, completely alone, incredibly vulnerable, and looking for work in an environment where so many others were also looking for work. I think in both of these books, Conlon McKenna does a fantastic job, again, of presenting history in a way which really teaches you something and gives you a sense of the hardships and difficulty of that time in history, without doing so in a way which would actually be traumatizing for children to read. I'm currently about halfway through the third book in the trilogy, which seems to be following all of the characters now. So we're seeing the eldest two characters in Ireland who are grown up and beginning to have families of their own, as well as continuing to follow Peggy's life in America. So those are some of my favourite books from this last year. I think if I had to choose an absolute favourite, it would definitely be Gormenghast specifically, so the second of the books by Mervyn Peake. It was just an absolute masterpiece. I've never read anything like it, and I can't wait to go back and reread it soon. Do let me know down in the comments what were some of your favourite books that you read this year. I would love to hear. I hope that you're all doing really well. Take care, and I will see you soon in another video. Goodbye!